Millennium Villages project for the Earth Institute at Columbia University, as well as an assistant professor for clinical biomedical informatics and clinical epidemiology at Columbia University. He will speak about the need for accurate and timely information regarding exposure to radioactivity in order to protect and promote public health. Dr. Kanter?
Thank you very much, Alfred, and to the organizers for giving us this opportunity to tell you a little bit more about this very serious situation. I'm going to speak a little bit about the importance of the Fukushima accident and the prior nuclear accidents to our understanding of public health and safety in this country. You've heard some extremely concerning remarks about the populations in Japan and the risks for Japan, and I in no way want to minimize those concerns. And I hope that our brothers and colleagues working in Japan feel our support for them in this very important work. Today, or actually just at the one-year anniversary of this terrible accident, Physicians for Social Responsibility released a report about the Fukushima accident, still dangerously unprepared. PSR has actually been around for 50 years now, and we began our activities with the issues of nuclear weapons and the dangers of a nuclear war. And since then, we've focused on the gravest threats to human health and survival on the planet, including nuclear power, as well as climate change and toxic degradation. The amount of education that has permeated the public about these issues has not been sufficient, and we have been trying to advocate along with our Japanese colleagues to make this information more public. You've seen some of these descriptions already, but just to repeat the key findings, that the 10-mile exclusion zones that are currently dictated for evacuations around nuclear reactors in the case of accidents by our Nuclear Regulatory Commission have clearly been proven to be insufficient. So not only have we seen that the evacuation zones, even in the 20-kilometer range in Fukushima, have been insufficient, but that radiation has traveled far beyond just the areas that we've already seen. This actually, I don't know if I can click the space bar just to see, just the space bar. No, all right. So actually what I was going to do, this is a simulation actually of the plumes that actually were measured by the actually the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization, which monitors very carefully releases of radiation across the globe as part of that not yet ratified test ban. But what this would have shown really is that over the period of the major releases, atmospheric releases, that most of the plume sort of moved out over the ocean. Only for a couple of days were there a slight amount of back over the Japanese mainland. So the numbers that you're seeing, these very high numbers that were shown in these other graphs, actually represent a tiny proportion of the amount of radiation that was actually released. Most of it actually extended out over the ocean. And there continues to be release of radioactive material into the ocean, not only from the steam and continued, the exposure of the reactor cores and fuel pools, but that the millions of gallons of water that are being continuously thrown on top of those reactors that are now outside of their containment needs to go somewhere. And we're constantly hearing reports about that leaking back into the ocean or into the groundwater. They're unable to keep up with the storage of this water, and we can anticipate that for many, many years, we are going to be generating huge numbers of gallons of water that have to be kept out of the environment. Oops. Just as a comparison, the reaction, the release of the radiation in Chernobyl actually produced large areas of exclusion. About 6,000 square miles around the Chernobyl plant is a permanent exclusion zone for the general population. And there, as I've mentioned already, that there are many areas already outside the evacuation zone within Fukushima that have the same levels of contamination. But as you can also see, is that there's another area up to 600 kilometers away from the Chernobyl accident where the land also has to be permanently excluded because of contamination. So these types of hotspots that you were seeing in Tokyo and around outside Fukushima are not unusual. So again, the notion that there can be a small exclusion area around nuclear power plants in the case of accident is clearly insufficient to protect the public health. So as an example, I wanted to do, repeat for those of you who haven't seen this, the Japanese government actually ran a series of simulations called SPEEDY at the time of the accident that actually closely approximated the release of radiation that was anticipated from the Fukushima accident. Now, of course, this was not made public at the time of the accident, and only now do we know that the amount of contamination that was likely released. We did a similar type of simulation using slightly different software to do this kind of analysis of what would happen in the case of a similar kind of accident here in the United States. And we used the Braidwood reactor that's outside of Chicago, Illinois. That's the Great Lake there. And what you can see is that if there was a significant release of, or loss of coolant, a major release of that coolant, of the radiation in the core, that it extends far beyond just the 50 miles. And as a matter of fact, up to 200,000 people would be exposed to enough radiation to make them sick, and of course, many thousands would die. Again, this would have happened in Japan if by chance the wind had been blowing the other way. This was an extremely fortunate situation where the vast majority of this in Japan of the radiation was released over the ocean. Even here, which we use this the EPA Protective Action Guideline area, which is the orange, shows that the amount of radiation exposure to all the way out to 200 miles away from the plant would be exposed and require evacuation. We did another analysis on what that would actually mean, because sometimes we think, oh, well, these people can just leave, why not? Well, not only are they going to leave probably forever, or for as long a time as most of their lives, let's say, into the decades for sure, but that there are many people who are exposed who are not able to leave. And so this simulation actually showed that there are 13,000 beds and 113 hospitals that would actually have to be evacuated. Now, most of those beds in this country are already full. We have the occupancy in our hospitals is 80, 90% at any time. Therefore, those people have to be moved, and many of them are not in any condition to be moved. Not only that, but the primary responders, the people who actually would go in to help, would also be significantly affected. So we're talking about 20,000 physicians who would be exposed and would not be able to actually participate. You get into the situation that they did, for example, with Fukushima 50, where the government basically changes the rules because the public health consequences of their non-action outweighs the potential sacrifice that those people are making. But we're not going to get, in this country, the American physician to suddenly risk their lives to go back into these environments to treat these patients in most cases. So many of the primary responders would not be available. The other point, I guess, is to comment in the lesson from Japan was that oftentimes these aren't one-off occurrences. That this is in the case of a natural disaster, and as climate change continues and there are more incredibly devastating climate effects, that there is likely to be widespread devastation, which means that the primary responders aren't going to be available. The roads are not going to be clear to get in there. So most of the people, just like when Physicians for Social Responsibility talked about the bombs going off, that most of those victims are not going to receive any help. the same kind of situation applies here, that they're not going to be the kind of response to come from the outside to really help. Now, we live in New York, or at least I do, and we are within 50 miles of the Indian Point reactor. Now, approximately 1/3 of the population of the United States actually lives within 50 miles of a reactor. Now, the director of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission recommended during the Fukushima accident that any Americans who live within 50 miles should leave. That same recommendation is not yet made here in the United States or by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, but if you did that, you can see that it's really hard to imagine that in this area, 17 million people fall within that circle around the Indian Point reactor. Now, we know that if the Indian Point reactor should suffer a Fukushima-like scenario, that there would be tens of thousands of people killed, probably somewhere between 100,000 to 500,000 people dying of cancer. And it could likely, economic costs, as you can imagine, what would happen to New York City would be in the trillions of dollars. So what we feel like is that the planning around and preparation for evacuations around nuclear power plants are incredibly insufficient and that need to be re-looked at. Clearly, in this situation, the Indian Point reactor, which is up for relicensing at this point, poses a grave risk to the 17 million people. I did want to talk about one of the issues that was raised by my colleagues from Japan about the low dose radiation and internal exposure, because what you will constantly hear is that there is a controversy about whether this kind of low dose exposure, the kind that actually reached the United States, whether it's a concern to public health. We're very lucky, actually. Just 2 days ago, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists published a special issue exactly looking at this low dose radiation. And although it recognizes that there is some controversy about really what are the effects of low dose radiation, it was clear that the most accepted policy about radiation is that there is no safe dose, that there's something called this no threshold relationship, which means that as you get lower and lower, there are still effects. And as we saw from the pictures, that even a single hot particle, if consumed or inhaled into the body, can produce a cancer. Now, what we do know is that much of the radiation numbers or risks that we are currently circulating are based upon a study of Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors. This has been a massive, expensive study which has produced extremely good data, but on, unfortunately, an irrelevant sort of patient population, or not totally relevant. And that is that the people who were part of that study were mostly the well people at the time, not the young, not the old and infirm. So the people most likely who would have suffered from the radiation were not actually part of the study. And that the radiation that occurred in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were short bursts, primarily gamma radiation, that was done to the outside of the body. And what we've just heard is that most of the exposure caused by radiation, low dose radiation from reactor accidents are internal, where they continue to radiate the surrounding tissue, either until it's excreted by the body or until that radioactive material reaches its end of its life. Now, what we know, and what many people had said in the past, was that low-dose, long-term source of exposure to radiation was actually less dangerous than Hiroshima and Nagasaki data. And much of the nuclear reactor sort of risk and nuclear worker risk assessments were based upon this notion that maybe it was even half as dangerous as just this exposure, very short-term exposure. Well, there were 3 studies that came out fairly recently, these nuclear worker studies, where you had exposure and pretty good dose estimates for people who work in nuclear power plants over a long period of time. one in 2005 involving 15 different countries and several 100,000 people, one in the United Kingdom in 2009, and another one, a meta-analysis of 12 countries in 2009. And what was remarkable and quite shocking about these studies is that they actually demonstrated the opposite. So the first study showed that the actual danger was at least as bad as the acute exposure of a short-term exposure, but the later ones actually showed that there may be 20% higher risk or even more of this kind of longer-term low-dose exposure, which is equivalent to the kind of exposure one gets when you consume or inhale these. So we've also, unfortunately, the Soviet Union has suffered often many, not just Chernobyl, but there have been many other nuclear accidents that have put many people, unfortunately, unwittingly to the test. There was a release of a large amount of radioactive material into the river in the Teka River in the early 50s that exposed, again, about 30,000 people to long-term exposure through the water supply. And what we found from that data really is that unlike what the proponents of nuclear power would like you to think, which is that at about 0.1 sieverts or 100 millisieverts, that there's somehow an immediate threshold or drop-off, that if we just don't get 0.1 sieverts, that there will be no effects or maybe even positive effects of the radiation. What we found actually is quite the opposite, which is that there is significant exposure dose and that it's even somewhat supernormal. In other words, there may even be this increased above linear about these exposures. Now, what this ultimately means is that it's true that for any given person, their risk is extremely small, that you will actually inhale that particular dose and get exposed to that amount of radiation that causes cancer. But what it means, though, is that if you take that low dose and expose a large number of people to that dose, that there will be a measurable effect. There's not going to be like a threshold. If everyone had less than 0.1, that there would be no cancers. No, there will be, approximately one cancer for every 1,000 or every 100 people who are exposed to that amount of radiation. So if you expose 100 people, you're going to have one cancer related to that, fatal cancer related to that exposure. So I think that what we have to recognize here is that radiation, no matter where you get it, is harmful. We take risks all the time for medical reasons to expose ourselves to radiation. We do that because we think that the benefit of that radiation outweighs whatever risk it might pose. Yet we do not X-ray children or pregnant women, right, because they are most susceptible. So even in that situation, X-rays are not outweighed. Yet we're willing to allow women and children to remain in these areas where they're being exposed to the equivalent of continual X-rays. Now, to top this off, because of nuclear testing, because of nuclear reactor accidents, we have put enough background radiation into the environment. This also includes the natural occurring ones that come from the planet itself. But that in 40 years, most people are exposed to this 0.1 already. So every little bit above that is already increased risk. So even the threshold question is kind of irrelevant. But what is clear is that all radiation is dangerous. The Physicians for Social Responsibility issued a similar call, and I guess I would say we will support and agree with the three proposals that have already been just made, but that the contamination of the food supply is a significant risk, that there needs to be ongoing monitoring of the food supply and the water supply, because that not only are there potential bioconcentrations, in other words, things like the tuna that swim along the outside of Japan, they eat smaller fish who have eaten smaller fish who eat the plankton and algae that have concentrated the cesium, so that their body burden of the radiation is much higher. So these fish, brought to the United States, of course, would be of risk to people consuming them. So it's very important that we do look into these internal exposures and keep a very close eye on monitoring. Now, of course, if the worst case scenario should happen, that there is an additional release, which is quite possible in Fukushima, then of course we would have to reinitiate even an atmospheric type monitoring of radiation, because as we just heard, that if the spent fuel should they burn in the number 4, we would release 10 times the amount of, is it 5 or 10 times the amount? 10 times the amount of existing radiation. That would again force us to relook at this. Again, the other thing we would like to also state is, again, in solidarity with our Japanese colleagues, that the 20 millisievert level that has been recommended as safe dose for children and the outside of Fukushima is clearly not acceptable. That if we take the numbers even from the Beer report, that children are 2 to 3 times more at risk of exposure to this radiation, and if they're out there being exposed to 20 millisieverts on a continual basis over, let's say, a period of 2 years, that we're talking about a large number of excess cancers in children, which is clearly not acceptable. So that ends my presentation, and I think we will move to discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you.